heavyweight application using Spring, you might find it hard to manage all of the dependencies that you need. Spring can be hard to work with when you first start off, and this is where Spring Boot really shines. Spring Boot makes it easy for you to work with Spring. Spring Boot is not an entirely new framework. In fact, it's an extension of the Spring framework. Spring Boot includes all of the same modules that Spring does. The whole objective of working with Spring Boot is to simplify how you develop your Spring based applications. Spring Boot does this by automatically pre configuring virtually all of the third party libraries that you'll use. It's quite possible that you've developed Spring applications using the Spring framework directly, and this can get hard, especially as the number of components that you work with increases. With Spring Boot, you'll find that your Spring applications just work. It seems almost like magic. If you work with Spring directly and you switch to Spring Boot, it's almost magical and hard to believe how easy Spring Boot makes everything. Let's discuss how Spring Boot simplifies Spring. It uses auto configuration. Auto configuration attempts to automatically configure your Spring application based on the jar dependencies that you've added. Based on the dependencies you have in your app will be configured automatically. Spring Boot also makes use of the parent pom.xml. Instead of explicitly specifying all the dependencies and versions that you need within your pom.xml in your Maven build configuration, you'll simply use a parent pom which has most of the dependencies pre-configured with the right versions as well. The reason why Spring Boot is so much easier than working with Spring directly is because Spring Boot takes the opinionated approach to setting up your application. This opinionated approach on the part of Spring Boot is what makes it easy to create standalone production grade Spring based applications that just work. What exactly does it mean that Spring has an opinionated approach? In software development, this term refers to an approach that intentionally reduces the flexibility available to the developer by making choices on behalf of the developer. This opinionated approach of Spring Boot basically means that you as a developer have to give up some control. The reason why your Spring Boot applications just work is because Spring Boot automatically provides implementations and sensible defaults. You can choose to go with these defaults if you want to, and things will work out of the box. This reduces the flexibility that you have as a developer, but overall simplifies the development process. It's important to understand though that this opinionated approach doesn't stop you from making granular configuration specifications for your app. You can still configure those things that you want to and use the defaults for the remaining components. I'll give you a few examples of Spring Boot's opinionated approach. Now, when you use Spring, Spring supports several build systems. You can use Maven, Gradle, Ant, and others. That choice is up to you. When you use Spring Boot, the recommended build systems are Maven or Gradle. Spring Boot doesn't really have great support for the Ant build system. Spring Boot, in fact, works best with a build system that can pull artifacts published to Maven Central. So, here is Spring Boot's opinion to get things to just work. Use a build system that works with artifacts in Maven Central, which is why we'll be using Maven for all of our demos. If you've set up a standalone Spring application, you know that Spring needs detailed dependencies and corresponding versions to be specified by you, the developer, before you can even get started. With Spring Boot, you can simply use the starter dependencies. These starter dependencies will pull in sensible defaults on your behalf. If you need to change those defaults, you'll need to specify additional configuration within your pom.xml. But these starter dependencies lets you get up and running in no time. These starter dependency templates are an important part of Spring Boot. So, what exactly are they? These are built in dependency descriptors that you include as a part of the pom.xml file for your Spring Boot application. A starter dependency descriptor will contain the granular dependencies and versions for all of the components that you need to build that particular kind of app. It will pull in and manage all dependencies, including transitive dependencies. With these starter dependency descriptors, all you need to know is the kind of Spring application that you're looking to build. Let's say you want to build a Spring Boot web application. Spring Boot Starter Web is the dependency that you'll specify. This will pull in all of the individual libraries that you need, including third party integrations with Apache Tomcat, Jetty, and Undertow. If you want to include unit tests and other kinds of tests along with your Spring application, you'll also include the Spring Boot starter test dependencies. You can specify multiple starter dependency templates. Let's say you're planning to build a UI based application and you need a template engine that allows you to render views. You can use the Spring Boot starter time leaf dependency. And these are just a few examples. As you work through the demos of this course, you'll find that there are many starter dependencies out there. You don't have to worry about the granular libraries and versions of those libraries. You simply specify the starter template, which simplifies your pom.xml file because you don't need to explicitly specify the third party dependency within this file. In addition, you don't need to specify the version number for each explicit dependency. You only specify the version for Spring Boot, and then Spring Boot will make sure that the versions of the individual dependencies all work with one another. They interoperate. Most of the dependency management complexity is part of the parent pom.xml that Spring Boot manages and generates. It's not your responsibility as a user unless you want some very granular configuration. What you create will be the user pom.xml, which is fairly simple and only specifies the starter dependencies. Let's discuss some more examples of how Spring Boot makes things easy. In Spring, as a developer, you need to specify the dispatcher servlet mappings and other configurations within your web app. With Spring Boot, all of these beans are created via auto configuration. What exactly is auto configuration? This is a way that Spring Boot uses to automatically configure your Spring application based on the jars and other Java dependencies that are found on the class path of the application. Spring Boot basically looks at the class path of your Java application and says, oh, here are all of these jars. This Spring application needs these jars. Make sure they are automatically available to the Spring application. The auto configuration feature in Spring Boot relies on specific Spring annotations, which are variants of the at configuration annotation. Each at configuration annotation is an opinionated default specified by your app. Now, these at configuration annotations are used conditionally, which means that if you have overridden the default specification for some property, your overridden version will be used, not the default. Thus, Spring Boot respects user provided defaults. So, if you don't want the default specification, you can override it. Otherwise, the default specification is there for you to use. Spring Boot auto configuration automatically detects and adds beans that you haven't explicitly manually configured. Within a Spring Boot app, you need to opt into this auto configuration by adding at enable auto configuration or at Spring Boot application to the entry point of your app. When we write code in just a little bit, you'll see that we'll discuss these annotations in a lot more detail. Now, auto configuration is non invasive, which means you automatically get sensible defaults, but you can replace individual implementations by defining your own beans wherever you want to. You can disable auto configured default classes in specific instances using either annotation attributes or properties that you specify in an XML file.